Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. We need to finish discussing the apology, right? And so in this lecture, we will finish our discussion. As you may recall, the structure of the apology is as follows. There is Socrates' defense. That includes the defense against the early accusations, which we've already covered. Then there's the defense against the official charges. We haven't done that yet, so we're going to do that in this lecture. Then there's the defense of Socrates' life as a whole. Okay, and that's the defense part of the text, which is most of it. Then there's the counter-assessment, in which Socrates says what he thinks the penalty should be after he's been found guilty. And then there are Socrates' final words to the jury. Okay, and in this case, I've put my end of text citation at the beginning here. I just want to be clear that I am using the translation by Grube and Cooper. That's the main reason I'm putting this citation here, so you'll know whose words I'm using. I mean, obviously, Plato's words, ultimately, but the translators should get some credit as well. What are the official charges against Socrates? Well, we've heard them in passing. Let's focus on them now. These are the charges that Miletus had to actually write down and file with the court. To be clear, this isn't just what's said in court. I'm emphasizing this because later there's a discrepancy between what Miletus wrote down and filed with the court and what he actually says in court. Anyway, here's what the written charges state according to our text. Socrates is guilty of corrupting the young and of not believing in the gods in whom the city believes, but in other new spiritual things. Okay, so first of all, Socrates does something to the Athenian youth. He makes them morally bad somehow. There's a suggestion there that he's teaching them bad things, but it's actually not explicitly stated in these charges that he's a teacher. So we don't need to go over that again, right? He's denied being a teacher already. And then we could roughly characterize the other charge as a charge of impiety, right? So Socrates doesn't have the right religious beliefs and he doesn't engage in the correct religious practices, right? Okay, so those are the two charges. And I do have a note here on some of the language. So spiritual things, that is a translation of daimonia. Okay, and you can hear, probably you can hear the relationship to the word demon, right? Daimonia are spiritual beings, we could say. The word things isn't really there in the Greek. These are spiritual beings who are not quite gods, at least that's typically how the word is used. So they're intermediary beings, they're below gods, but above mortals, are certainly different from mortals, right? So it's a loose term, a little vague, so the translator didn't mind saying spiritual things, and in fact, later in this presentation, I'll talk about spiritual stuff, and I think that's fair, given the Greek term actually at issue here. Okay, and I want to point out that daimonia is closely related to daimonian, and when Socrates speaks about his voice, that tells him not to do things, right? He says it doesn't tell him to do things, but only prohibits him basically from doing stuff. It kept him out of politics, he says. That's his daimonian. So he has some kind of spiritual presence inside him, right? Which maybe provokes envy. So his daimonian talks to him and keeps him out of trouble, he believes. Okay. Okay, so looking at the first official charge, Socrates corrupts the youth, there are two arguments that Socrates makes against this first charge. In the first argument, which goes from 24d to 25b, Socrates is trying to show that Meletus doesn't really have the expertise, he doesn't have the moral standing either to make the charge that he's making. So Socrates tries to argue that Meletus doesn't really know anything about benefits and harms. Okay, so to be clear, if you claim that someone corrupts the youth, you're talking about a moral harm, right? You've put their souls in a worse condition, so you've done some kind of harm to them, right? And so Meletus would need to know how youths are harmed and benefited. Those two things seem to go together, right? Meletus needs to know how youths are harmed and benefited in order to claim with credibility that Socrates has corrupted the youth. Okay, so that's what this argument is about. I am going to read quite a bit of it here because it's dramatic and the argument takes place in a back and forth. Not that Meletus contributes a lot, but it's important to see how Socrates is interacting with him. Then we'll summarize the argument. Okay, so hopefully I can bring some of the drama out for you. Again, we're looking at 24d. That's where we're starting. So in the Gruben Cooper translation, this is the top of page 29. Socrates says, "Come here and tell me, Meletus. Surely you consider it of the greatest importance that our young men be as good as possible." "Indeed I do," says Meletus. "Come then, tell these men who improves them. You obviously know in view of your concern. You say you have discovered the one who corrupts them, namely, me, and you bring me here and accuse me to these men. Come, inform these men and tell them who it is who improves them." "You see, Meletus, that you are silent and know not what to say. Does this not seem shameful to you, and a sufficient proof of what I say, that you have not been concerned with any of this? Tell me, my good sir, who improves our young men?" "The laws," says Meletus. "That is not what I am asking. But what person who has knowledge of the laws to begin with?" "These jurymen, Socrates." "How do you mean, Meletus? Are these able to educate the young and improve them?" "Certainly." "All of them, or some but not others?" "All of them." "Oh, very good, by Hera! You mention a great abundance of benefactors. But what about the audience? Do they improve the young or not?" "They do too." "What about the members of council?" "The counselors also." "But Meletus, what about the assembly? Do members of the assembly corrupt the young, or do they all improve them?" "They improve them." "All the Athenians, it seems, make the young into fine good men, except me, and I alone corrupt them. Is that what you mean?" "That is most definitely what I mean." "You condemn me to a great misfortune. Tell me, does this also apply to horses, do you think? that all men improve them, and one individual corrupts them? Or is quite the contrary true? One individual is able to improve them, or very few, namely the horse breeders, whereas the majority, if they have horses and use them, corrupt them. Is that not the case, Meletus, both with horses and all other animals? Of course it is, whether you and Anytus say so or not. It would be a very happy state of affairs if only one person corrupted our youth while the others improved them. You have made it sufficiently obvious, Meletus, that you have never had any concern for our youth. You show your indifference clearly, that you have given no thought to the subjects about which you bring me to trial. Okay, so you can see how Socrates paints Meletus into a corner here, and Meletus cooperates. So what's going on here? Why does Meletus cooperate? Socrates knows that Meletus wants to make Socrates look as bad as possible, and he knows that Meletus is not a careful thinker or talker. He doesn't make careful arguments. So he can use the fact that Meletus wants to put him in a bad light and just proceed to ask him about all these different groups, right? We've mentioned the assembly is the legislative body. All the male citizens of Athens are in the assembly, right? So, there's a question about the jury, which is already, 500 people. There's a question about the audience. There's hundreds of people in the audience. There's a question about the council. That's another 100 people or so, something like that. When Socrates finally gets to the assembly, that's really everybody that the Athenians would have thought was important, I'm sorry to say, So just the male citizens, they were the ones who mattered. So in some sense, Meletus ends up saying, everybody benefits, the youth except you, Socrates, which of course is ludicrous on the face of it. Socrates gives an analogy to try to show that it's ludicrous, but you can just see on the face of it, it's a silly thing to say. There are all kinds of people in Athens, right? There are tens of thousands of people in the assembly. Some of them are arsonists, some of them are rapists, whatever. There's all different kinds that have done lots of different bad things. It doesn't make any sense to single out Socrates and say, he's the only one who corrupts the youth and everyone else benefits them. It just doesn't make sense. Okay, so how do we summarize the argument? Premise 1, Meletus says that every adult male citizen of Athens benefits the young, whereas I, Socrates, alone corrupt them. 2, but it generally takes expert knowledge or expertise to benefit a living thing, while it is easy to corrupt the same thing out of ignorance. I have some basset hounds at home, and they're spoiled and stubborn, so I can vouch for this. Number 3, furthermore, only the few possess expertise in any given area, while the many are ignorant in that area, right? You've got some horse breeders who specialize in dealing with horses, and they can make the horses behave well, but most people can't do it. You've got, dog whisperers who can make the basset hounds do what we want, but then you've got most people who are like me who, can't really overcome their stubbornness. Okay, number 4. When we apply 3 and 4 to the youth of Athens, we see that we should expect only a few Athenian adults, namely the relevant experts, to be able to benefit the young, while most people, whom we may call the many or the ignorant, will corrupt them out of their ignorance. 5. Now we're getting a conclusion, or a more robust conclusion even. right? 4 was a bit of a sub-conclusion. Anyway, 5. Therefore, Meletus has said something absurd about the nature of benefiting and corrupting the young. 6. Therefore, Meletus has not given adequate thought to the nature of benefiting and corrupting the young. Finally, number 7. Therefore, he is not entitled to pass judgment on others for corrupting them. Right? So again, this doesn't directly show that Socrates didn't corrupt the youth, and it certainly doesn't show that Socrates benefited the youth, and Socrates doesn't make that claim. He is confident, and I've already conceded this, that he has benefited the people of Athens, but right now we're talking about the youth. I don't think Socrates wants to claim to know how to benefit the youth. So he's not saying he has the knowledge that Meletus is lacking. He's just saying Meletus doesn't have the knowledge, and so Meletus can't make the claim that he's making, not legitimately or not with credibility. Now we need to look at the second argument against the first official charge. As I've already mentioned, the first argument is not direct. It's directed at Meletus. It's not really directly addressing the charge, right? It's not saying or not concluding that Socrates didn't corrupt the youth. It certainly doesn't conclude that he benefited the youth, right? Anyway, this one's more direct, and we don't need to read it from the text, so we'll just summarize it here. Okay, argument number 2. Premise number 1. People do not willingly harm themselves. That's a good place to begin because it's plausible. People don't want to be harmed. They don't willingly harm themselves. Seems right. And it's broad, so there's a lot of room for making implications from this statement, right? Okay. Premise 2. If I, Socrates, were to corrupt the youth of Athens, I would make them bad. That's just what corruption means, right? Number 3, but then they would be liable to harm me on account of their badness and their proximity to me, right? That's why Socrates in the text asks Meletus about neighbors. Hey, what kind of neighbors do you want to have? Good neighbors or bad neighbors? There's an issue of proximity, right? Socrates has to live with the Athenian youth in Athens, okay? So why would he want to make them bad? They're right there. They're right next to him. Okay, number 4, here's a sub-conclusion. So I could not have corrupted the Athenian youth deliberately or willingly, right? In a way, Socrates is performing his knowledge of all this, right? In other words, you wouldn't corrupt the youth if you realized that, well, then they'll be bad and you're living there in the same city with them, right? And by giving the argument, Socrates shows his awareness of this, right? So that's an interesting aspect of the argument, I think. Number 5, therefore, either I did not corrupt them at all, or I did so accidentally. So this is our main conclusion, I would say. Socrates is sincere here. He's not going to argue that he didn't corrupt them. He's not pretending to have the knowledge that Meletus is pretending to have. It's a big deal to bring up the young in the right way, and so Socrates is not going to claim to know how to do that, right? So maybe I didn't corrupt them. He's not going to definitively assert he didn't, but maybe I didn't corrupt them. That's compatible with what we know. Or, I might have done it accidentally. However, right, and then we get to line 6 here. Therefore, I shouldn't be on trial. since A, in the first case, there is no wrong to be addressed by a trial, and B, in the second case, that's the one where I corrupted them accidentally, Athenian law requires that I be given private instruction before being brought to trial, and Miletus has not offered me private instruction, right? I mean, Athenian law is obviously different from law in the United States, but at the same time, we get what's going on here. Willfulness matters, mental state matters, intention matters, right? To deliberately corrupt the youth is obviously wrong. To accidentally corrupt the youth does not seem to be criminal here, and yet here we are at trial, and Miletus hasn't tried to correct Socrates, right? If Miletus had tried to correct him, and then Socrates refused to be corrected, that would show willfulness. That would show mental state was intend to harm or negligence, something more blamable than, oops, I didn't know I was saying corrupting things. Okay. There are, of course, apparent counterexamples to this first premise. People do not willingly harm themselves. Maybe you thought of them while I was talking about the argument, right? But Socrates can handle them, I would say, right? So you might worry, oh, Socrates says people don't willingly harm themselves, but look, some people commit suicide. Okay. So how would Socrates handle that kind of case? Well, I think he might do it with a dichotomy. So some people might be deranged, right? And they're not really in control of themselves. And so they might kill themselves because they're psychotic or hallucinating or something like that. Those people aren't willingly harming themselves, right? They're deranged. Okay, but then there's another kind of case in which, someone's suffering, right? Why do people commit suicide when they're not deranged? Well, they're typically suffering, right? They could suffer from very, very bad depression, and it's painful to be depressed. And so the thought process that we figure the person is having is, well, if I die, then I won't experience the pain of depression. Or some people are in terrible physical pain, right? And they want to escape the terrible physical pain. So that actually fits with what Socrates is saying. These people aren't pursuing harms, they're pursuing benefits, right? If I'm pursuing the cessation of pain, the end of pain, that's a benefit for me. So am I willingly harming myself if I'm in terrible, terrible pain and there's no possible relief? And I'm not saying that's always the case, but that's a kind of case that we could deal with. I'm in terrible pain, there's no possible relief available. Aren't I pursuing a benefit then? If I kill myself, you got to kind of set any preconceptions about suicide, aside for now. Yes or no? Well, it looks like you're pursuing a benefit, right? Whether we like it or not, or maybe we don't like how you're doing it. Maybe we think you're wrong, that there's no possible relief. But we could still see that you're pursuing a benefit, okay? So Socrates could say, he could refine his principle a little bit, and he could say, well, people don't pursue net harms, right? Just like we distinguish between gross profit and net profit. Gross profit is just, well, what money came in. Net profit is, well, subtract the expenses from the money that came in, and what's left over? Well, that's the net profit. That's the remaining amount, right? So people pursue net benefits. In other words, they're willing to accept something harmful or painful if they think they're going to get something even better out of the deal, right? So Socrates can defend himself here, ultimately, is what I'm saying. There are apparent counterexamples to the idea that people don't willingly harm themselves, but Socrates could use this general strategy that I just employed for the case of suicide and say, well, people pursue net benefits, right? Okay, so I'll leave it to you to work out how Socrates could talk about other apparent counterexamples. Okay, so now we're finally getting to the second official charge, right? Socrates doesn't believe in the city's gods, but in other new spiritual stuff. Okay, so how does Socrates deal with it? Well, this argument is also indirect, which could be disappointing. You might think, well, why doesn't Socrates argue that he has the right beliefs? Actually, I think this is good strategy, because if his beliefs are being questioned, it's just not going to be rhetorically powerful to say, oh, but I do have the right beliefs. I believe this and this and that. Right? His credibility is being questioned. So then when he says the correct beliefs, people are likely to think he's being insincere. So instead of directly tackling the issue, he again tries to undermine Meletus, and Meletus makes it easy, right? So why not? Okay, and this argument can be found from 25c to 26a. It starts with Socrates asking Meletus to clarify a point. Hey, are you calling me a complete atheist? Or are you saying I believe in new spiritual stuff? And then Meletus says, I'm calling you an atheist. And again, it's easy to bait Meletus. Socrates knows Meletus is trying to make him look bad. So Socrates asks, do you think I'm a complete atheist, with some confidence that Meletus will say yes, right? But of course that leads to this charge of inconsistency here, right? So let's look at the argument. Number one, in the courtroom just now, Meletus accused me of being a complete atheist. Number two, yet in his written affidavit, Meletus accused me of believing in new spiritual stuff. Number three, but if I, Socrates, believe in spiritual stuff, then I must believe in spirits. Makes sense. In much the same way that if one believes in horsey stuff or fluty stuff, then one must be committed to the existence of horses or flutes. Number four, and we Greeks, right, we've got to deal with the Greek language here, so I've thrown in the Greek context. And we Greeks take it that spirit, or daimon, means either God or child of God, right? We mentioned this earlier. Probably means child of God or some kind of spiritual intermediary, right? Number five, so, right, we're getting to a conclusion here. So, according to what Meletus wrote in his affidavit, no matter what the spirit of spiritual stuff refers to, whether gods or the children of gods, I must believe in gods. Right? Socrates is not directly saying, I believe in gods. He's saying, well, when Meletus says, I believe in spiritual stuff, he is implying that I believe in gods, right? Number six, but clearly I cannot be a complete atheist and believe in gods. So Meletus says I'm an atheist when I ask him directly, but Meletus also says I believe in gods in his written affidavit because he says I believe in spiritual stuff. Okay. Number seven, therefore, Meletus is not trustworthy, and we must not take his charges against me seriously. Okay, so I think that's a nice way for Socrates to handle this official charge, without just stating religious beliefs that people aren't going to find credible, probably. Okay, so that's the end of the defense against the official charges, right? Having defended himself against the official charges, Socrates wants to move on to defending his life as a whole. He actually explicitly says in the text, well, that's enough about the official charges, right? And then he talks for a long time before we get to the counter assessment, right? And so I've already said, what's going on there? It looks like he wants to defend his reputation, and that makes sense, as I've already mentioned. These charges are vague, they're broad at best, but I would say they're vague. It's not clear what they mean. So then Socrates wants to show, I've had good intentions, I've tried to be a benefit. He's pretty confident about benefiting the adults, it seems to me. Okay, so he's defending his life as a whole, and then this is a little subjective. I've got this list of 3 things that I think are just really interesting and powerful, right? So it's my list. I don't claim a lot of objectivity here, but these are interesting points that I want to pick out, okay? Point number 1, it is right for a person to stay at his or her post when he or she has been placed there by a superior. That point can be found at 28D, probably elsewhere. Either directly or indirectly. It's more or less explicit in other places. Anyway, this is kind of clever. Socrates elsewhere explicitly reminds the jury of his military service. He has actually defended Athens in the military. This is an indirect reference to his military service. So the literal content of what he's saying is, well, Apollo told me to philosophize, so I'm philosophizing, right? But we're indirectly, or he's indirectly making a reference to his military service. Also, this word superior is interesting, right? So in the military, you have a superior, someone's above you in the hierarchy, and then you have to do what they say. You have a duty, right, as a soldier to go where you're ordered to go. But also, this is really a reference to Apollo saying no one is wiser than Socrates, which set Socrates out on a quest to go find wisdom. So as we've said, Socrates' take on that is the God ordered me to philosophize, okay? So superior here means a being who is morally and intellectually superior, not just someone above me in the hierarchy, right? So should you listen if you have access to someone who's morally and intellectually superior and they're suggesting you do something, yeah, you should listen. So it's a good point, interesting, it's got a lot of resonance. Okay, point number 2, disobeying the God is a known evil, while it is not known whether death is a good or an evil. So I've quoted Socrates here on this point. He says at 29a, to fear death, gentlemen, is no other than to think oneself wise when one is not, to think one knows what one does not know. No one knows whether death may not be the greatest of blessings for a man, yet men fear it as if they knew that it is the greatest of evils. So that's got some resonance as well. On the one hand, Socrates is just saying, well, if I'm comparing goods and harms, benefits and harms, there's obeying the God, that's good. Obeying the God by philosophizing specifically, that's good. Death, you could say, you're going to kill me if I don't quit philosophizing, or you're going to kill me unless I disobey the god, I don't even know if death is good or bad. So shouldn't I focus on what I know is good, which is philosophizing according to the order from Apollo? Shouldn't I focus on that? Seems like it, because since I don't really know about death, right? So that just fits in well with the whole approach to the trial, right? Socrates doesn't know anything worthwhile, so he doesn't have any great insight into death. But we all know, if we're in an Athenian context, we all know that obeying the gods is good and pious, and Socrates is going to be good and pious despite what Meletus is saying. All right, and Socrates is doing the city a great service at his own expense. He's some kind of gadfly. Let's look at this one in the text. Okay, so 30D, going into E. Socrates says to the jury, "Be sure that if you kill the sort of man I say I am, you will not harm me more than yourselves." Wow, that's a big claim. Yeah, I don't know about death, so I don't know if you can harm me, but I've tried to be beneficial, so you could certainly harm yourselves by removing me, right? "Neither Meletus nor Anytus can harm me in any way. He could not harm me, for I do not think it is permitted that a better man be harmed by a worse. Certainly he might kill me, or perhaps banish or disfranchise me, which he and maybe others think to be great harm. But I do not think so. I think he is doing himself much greater harm, doing what he is doing now, attempting to have a man executed unjustly. That is bad for Meletus's soul. That is going to hang around him like an albatross. He's not going to be able to cleanse the guilt. Indeed, men of Athens, I am far from making a defense now on my own behalf, as might be thought, but on yours, to prevent you from wrongdoing by mistreating the god's gift to you by condemning me. For if you kill me, you will not easily find another like me. I was attached to this city by the god, though it seems a ridiculous thing to say, as upon a great and noble horse, which was somewhat sluggish because of its size, and needed to be stirred up by a kind of gadfly. It is to fulfill some such function that I believe the god has placed me in the city." So there's that idea of a post again. "I never cease to rouse each and every one of you, to persuade and reproach you all day long, and everywhere I find myself in your company. Another such man will not easily come to be among you, gentlemen, and if you believe me, you will spare me." Okay, I went a little bit into 31A there. Just wanted you to get the full flavor of what's going on. What really amuses me here, and I will admit to being amused, I think Socrates is hilarious, by the way, I really do. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. He's just so full of irony. It's just the conflict between the different attitudes there is just hilarious, to me, at least. So he doesn't know anything worthwhile, but he's so confident about certain things. So he's God's gift. That's the part that really cracks me up, right? We often say of other people, oh, he thinks he's God's gift. Socrates is saying quite directly here, I am God's gift. Don't mistreat the gift, man. So I'm a gadfly. I get you riled up. I get you roused up, right? I won't let you sleep. If you keep reading around, you will understand, if you don't already, that the sense in which Socrates is waking people up is he's making them look at their souls. Right? They're walking around not fully aware of what's in their souls. They don't know what they know and what they don't know, so that's an issue of the soul. They don't know what virtue is, and they don't know whether they have virtue, and that's an issue of the soul, and they don't know about happiness and whether they're happy, right? Socrates thinks that he can help them get closer to happiness by getting them to reflect on what it is and what kind of progress they're making toward it. Okay, so they're asleep. He's trying to wake them up. Isn't that nice? Well, he says it is. It's very kind of him to neglect his livelihood and be poor so he can go around provoking people. Okay, and he also tells a couple of stories about himself that the jury will know is true, right? That's part of the point. He's telling these stories to people who know that they're true, so he's reminding them, I don't care about death, right? So he was on the council which governs Athens day to day, right? So the assembly legislates, but the assembly can't convene every day, obviously. So there's a council that is an executive body that runs things, and there's a lot of rotation in and out of the council. The Athenians don't want people to permanently rule over them. They don't want any tyrants, right? So there's a lot of rotation. So Socrates was on the council at one point. This was during the Peloponnesian War. Everyone else on the council apparently wanted to try 10 generals for their behavior. You know, you could look it up in the text what the whole story is about. They didn't like the way the generals acquitted themselves in one of these battles, right? And so they wanted to try the generals as a whole, as a body, because it's quick and efficient, but that's not correct law. That's not the correct legal procedure. So Socrates was trying to stop them and say, you have to try each person individually. You're not respecting their rights. Not that the Greeks tended to talk in those terms, but Socrates was saying something like that. They have certain rights granted to them by the Athenian constitution. You're running over their rights. You can't do it. Everyone was getting mad at Socrates. They were threatening to kill him, but he didn't stop. He just said, you can't do it. And then they did it anyway, right? And I'm sure they had some regrets. They were worked up when they did it, and yeah. So they know Socrates pushes hard on what he thinks is right. And then, so that was when the democracy was still in power, before the Spartans beat the Athenians, right, in the final battle, and they installed a puppet government. Then when the puppet government was in place, when the 30 were ruling, the 30 ordered Socrates and some other people to go get this guy, Leon from Salamis. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that in the way that Socrates would have, but anyway, they said to him, go get Leon from Salamis, we want to execute him, right? And Socrates went home. He just defied the order, and they ordered 5 people to do it. The other 4 went and got Leon, and Socrates didn't do anything. And yeah, the 30, they were tyrannical. They probably would have killed Socrates if it weren't for the fact that the government, the puppet government, fell shortly after that. Okay. And then finally, in this part of the text, Socrates tries to exhort and educate the jurors, right? He says it would be wrong of him to beg for mercy, wrong of him to bring in his family and try to make the jury cry or whatever. They're supposed to respond to evidence, not to emotional displays. They're not supposed to let people off because they feel bad or they have pity or whatever. So Socrates is happy to tell them this. This is how a jury should behave, right? And he also says, I don't want you to break your oaths to the gods, right? You swore an oath to, come to the right conclusion based on the evidence. So I won't emotionally manipulate you. You look at the evidence and you come to the right conclusion, which is that I didn't do anything, right? I didn't do anything blameworthy. Okay, so he's happy to cajole and educate and exhort, and it probably just annoyed the jury, quite honestly, but I think this is Socrates' calling, his vocation, so he feels that he must. Okay, and then famously, Socrates is found guilty, despite what he says, right? The vote is 280 to 220. Socrates thought that was awfully close. He expected they would vote him guilty by a larger margin. That's what he says. And then Miletus proposes the death penalty, and that's not directly in the text, right? There's a break in the text, and then Socrates starts talking again, okay? And I've already said the counter assessment, that's when Socrates proposes a penalty, right? So Miletus has already said he should die for what he's done. That's the assessment. Now Socrates gets to say what he thinks the penalty should be. And he says a lot of different things. So it might, I don't know if it's confusing. But the first thing he says must be the most honest thing, even though it's probably coming off as sarcastic, right? He says, well, again, I've neglected my affairs, I've neglected my job, my livelihood, so I could go around and talk to you about virtue and happiness. So what do I really deserve? Something nice. So the Olympic athletes who competed for Athens, when they won, they would often be treated to free lodging and food, basically at the Prytaneum. So the Prytaneum is a public hall where people are feasted. So out-of-town dignitaries might be feasted there if they came to visit. As I said, Olympic athletes might be feasted there. So that's what Socrates deserves. Give me free food and lodging in the Prytaneum. That's what I should have. He says to the jury, these athletes make you think you're happy. They make you seem happy to yourself. You know, the translation is a little difficult here, I think, based on what I've read. So anyway, these athletes make you feel like you're happy, but I actually make you be happy, which is quite a statement. Again, there's a lot going on. This is a complicated guy, so I like the paradox of it. Okay, he knows, though, the jurors aren't going to really like this proposal, that he be feasted in the Prytaneum, right? So he actually tries to defend the proposal a little bit. He tries to argue against other possible punishments, right? In prison, he'll be under people's thumb. He'll be a sort of slave. You know, a fine is not a big deal, except that he doesn't have any money. It's not really harming him if he gives up some money, but he doesn't have much. He won't propose exile because his fellow Athenians can't really put up with him. Look what they're doing to him. So why should he expect he'll be welcomed somewhere else? He's kind of saying, why don't you just kill me then, right? He's really goading the jury, like, either feast me in the Prytaneum, which is what I deserve, or kill me. These other punishments kind of stink. I'm not going to argue for them. Why should I argue that you should put me in prison or exile me? I don't want those things. I'm not going to argue for them. And I don't deserve them. I deserve something good. Okay. Socrates says, you might be wondering why I can't shut up if I'm exiled, right? So he argues against exile, right? There's no point in exiling me. People are going to get upset with me elsewhere. So the jury might think, well, why can't you go somewhere else and shut up? What about that? And then Socrates says, well, you won't believe me, but I have to do what the God has ordered me to do, right? And then there's this famous thing he says, you'll believe me even less when I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. On the other hand, if I say that it is the greatest good for a man to discuss virtue every day, and those other things about which you hear me conversing and testing myself and others, for the unexamined life is not worth living for men or for human beings, you will believe me even less. Right? So this is the famous point at which he says, the unexamined life is not worth living. Right? So again, either reward me like I deserve, feast me in the Prytaneum, or just kill me. There's no point in exiling me. I know that philosophizing is good, so I intend to keep doing that until you kill me. And you're not going to cow me by threatening to kill me. I don't even know if death is bad, so I'm going to keep philosophizing since I know that's good. Finally, he knows the jury isn't buying any of this, and so he proposes a fine that he can actually afford. Right, he says, I'll give you 1 mina, which apparently is a very small sum, and it ticks the jury off, so that's why I've got this picture here of Socrates holding a coin. I thought it would be amusing. Okay, so he says, I'll give you 1 mina, that's what I've got. And then his friends, probably Plato was involved here, his friends like wave at him or whatever, they try to get his attention, and they tell him, we'll give you some money. So then he says, okay, I can pay 30 minae, right? Plural of mina. I could pay 30 minae, so that's my final offer. I don't really know what exactly the jury voted on. I guess they had to decide when they had a discussion about it. Well, which penalty are we voting on? I think they voted on the 30 minae. So they were voting, do we kill him like Miletus proposed, or do we let him pay this fine when we know his friends are putting up most of the money? Which is it going to be? Well, we know that they vote Socrates to death, but I'll say more about that on the next slide. Right now, I want to consider this point that the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates does not argue for that here. Okay, so I want to consider a couple of arguments. I've tried to certainly construct the first one in the spirit of Socrates based on what I know from other dialogues, but also I've got an argument against Socrates' position that is in line with our cultural beliefs, let us say. So we'll kind of let Socrates argue against what I would consider the common view in our culture here. All right, so on behalf of Socrates, argument number 1, bondage makes human beings unhappy. Well, that sounds right. You don't want to be locked up, right? Number 2, therefore humans require freedom to be happy. Number 3, at the same time, freedom requires choosing from among authentic options. Not trivial ones, but real options that would make us happy. Number 4, furthermore, one cannot be aware of one's authentic options without examination, especially of oneself, one's desires and aptitudes, for instance. In general, you can't be aware of options without examining the data, but I'm also saying well, authentic options, real options, but those must be suited to you, among other things. So if you want to know what your authentic options are, the ones that might actually work out for you, you will have to look within and think about yourself and take yourself into account. Number 5, therefore, one cannot have freedom without self-examination. Number 6, therefore, humans require self-examination to be happy. I think that's very appealing. Okay, and then what might we say in response? And I'm actually endorsing argument number 1, but here's what our culture seems to think. Premise number 1, only I have genuine knowledge of what is required to make me happy. Number 2, furthermore, what is needed to make human beings happy varies greatly among individual human beings. I agree with the second point. I'm not sure about the first point. Number 3, so though I might gain knowledge of some or all of the requirements for my own happiness, that knowledge is not applicable to others. Number 4, therefore we find ourselves unable to provide any objective requirements for happiness. Number 5, in claiming that human beings require self-examination to be happy, Socrates attempts to lay down an objective requirement for happiness. Number 6, therefore Socrates' claim that human beings require self-examination to be happy must be incorrect. Okay, so I've tried to make that sound good. I think it fits with our cultural norms. You have to think about which argument you agree with, but I would attack, if I were in this debate, I'm really just the referee right now, but if I were in this debate, I would attack premise number 1 here. Only I have genuine knowledge of what is required to make me happy. That's not likely, right? So if there's any such thing as human nature, and I believe there is, then we share some of our requirements for happiness. And so someone might know more about human nature and therefore know more about what's required to make me happy than I do. I think that's true. That's why I'm saying it. But I'm not trying to make you believe this or that here. I'm just saying, here's Socrates' argument. Here's an argument based on our cultural norms. Excuse me. So you think about which one you believe here. Okay. So Socrates is condemned to death. As we know, the vote gets worse, which is interesting, right? So now it's 360 to 140. I think the 140 were voting for the 30 minute fine, as I've said, but I'm not sure based on the text we have. Okay, so I guess Socrates annoyed the jury by saying he should be feasted in the Prytaneum, and maybe they were insulted by the offer of 1 mina, and they certainly don't think it's much of a punishment if his friends pay money on his behalf. So they're annoyed for whatever reasons. There are probably multiple reasons. So yeah, so the vote is worse. It was 280 to 220. Now it's 360 to 140. Socrates continues to defend himself, right? He thinks if the jury were being objective, they would realize that his arguments were fine and that Miletus doesn't have a good case, right? He thinks Miletus would actually end up getting fined if Anytus weren't behind all of this. Anytus is a prominent Democrat, as I've mentioned, right? He had to flee when the 30 came into power. So he was a target. He was known to be a defender of the democracy. So his reputation is doing some work here. Socrates believes that's the case. If it were just Miletus, who's coming across as a fumbler, then Miletus wouldn't have gotten 100 votes. He wouldn't have gotten a fifth of the votes, and he would have gotten fined as a result. That's what Socrates believes. Okay. Um, and I'm quoting from him again because this is powerful stuff, I think. He's glad he gave a good defense and not a pathetic defense in which he begged for mercy. He says, neither I nor any man should, on trial or in war, contrive to avoid death at any cost. Indeed, it is often obvious in battle that one could escape one's death by throwing away one's weapons and by turning to supplicate one's pursuers. And there are many ways to avoid death and every kind of danger, if one will venture to do or say anything to avoid it. It is not difficult to avoid death, gentlemen. It is much more difficult to avoid wickedness, for it runs faster than death. Slow and elderly as I am, I have been caught by the slower pursuer, whereas my accusers, being clever and sharp, have been caught by the quicker wickedness. I leave you now condemned to death by you, but they are condemned by truth to wickedness and injustice. So he's sticking by his principles. He's not sorry. You could imagine someone saying, "Oh, I don't care if you threaten to kill me," but then when that person's actually sentenced to death, maybe they finally get upset or they break down. But Socrates says, "Okay, well, you're worse off." I don't know if death is bad, but wickedness is, and you have condemned an innocent man, right? You've unjustly condemned me. You've corrupted your own soul, so that's too bad for you, right? And so he says a severe punishment will overtake you, more severe than my criticisms, right? So Socrates thinks he's been holding the young people back in the sense that they've been content to just watch him, right? So he's gone around and interrogated people and tried to make them accountable for themselves, for their lives, for the states of their souls. So the young people have been content to watch, but when Socrates is gone, then they will go hold people accountable. They will be harsh judges because of their youth, right? When you get older, you kind of mellow out. Right? I used to be a harsher grader, for instance, just one for instance. I'm not an easy grader, I guess, but I've mellowed, I've chilled a little bit. That's just how it is. That's a natural thing that happens. Diogenes Laertius, who's known for writing histories about philosophers, he wrote a book on the lives of the philosophers. He wrote that Miletus was kind of run out of town after Socrates' death. So it looks like the Athenians regretted this. They were kind of worked up. Miletus managed to get them worked up, even though he's a fumbler. So they were willing to sentence Socrates to death, but they didn't like what they had done, and so they ran Miletus out of town. They ran Miletus out of town afterwards, apparently. So, in some sense, Socrates has threatened those who voted against him. He's not going to come after them, right? He's not going to do anything bad. Their own evil doing will catch up with them, right? And bad things will occur. Okay, well, he also talks to the true judges. There's a sort of ambiguity there that we don't need to get into. The true judges, the true jury members, they've judged correctly. They've seen that Socrates hasn't done anything wrong. Okay. And he wants to reassure them. He wants to tell them, don't worry about me. I've got that daimonion, as you will recall. I've got this voice that keeps me safe. It has helped me all my life. I'm not sure that's true, but that's Socrates' belief. It's helped me stay out of trouble. It kept me out of politics, which would have been a disaster for me. That part I believe, right? So he says, yeah, don't worry. I gave the kind of defense I wanted to give, and the voice didn't stop me. It never said, Socrates, you should tone it down. It never said, Socrates, you shouldn't say that, right? And since it's been protecting me all my life, that makes me think, oh, well, this is fine. How this has turned out is fine. I've been sentenced to death, but I wasn't sure about death anyway, whether it was good or bad, so perhaps this has all turned out for the best, right? He's able to have equanimity and be philosophical about the fact that he's going to die, right? Maybe he just would have gotten into more trouble if he had lived longer. He's sure he's been beneficial, so this is an okay time to go out, right? That seems to be how he's looking at things. And then also he shares his thoughts about death, right? Death seems to be one of two things most likely, right? So death could just be the complete absence of experience, and that makes it like a good night's sleep. I've got an exclamation point there because, well, it's not like anything, right? It's the absence of experience. But anyway, that's not bad. A complete absence of experience can't make you feel bad. It's not painful, so maybe it's not what you want, but at the same time, it seems like it's not bad. And if it really is somehow like a good night's sleep, well, that's fine. I agree with Socrates. As you get older, you appreciate a good night's sleep more and more, right? It's harder to sleep through the night, so it grows in estimation as you get older. And then if that's not what death is, well, then presumably it's the migration of the soul to some other place, some other plane of existence. And then if Socrates goes there, well, then I guess that's where people go in general. Why should Socrates be special, right? So he'll go where all the other dead people have gone. So Solon will be there, and he could talk about democracy, and Achilles will be there, and he can talk to Achilles about bravery. Socrates does think he's similar to Achilles, and maybe he's right. They're stubborn, and they do what they think is right, despite the danger of death looming over them, right? So Achilles had to avenge his friend Patroclus, even though the gods told him, you will die if you avenge your friend. He avenged him anyway, right? He thought that was the right thing to do. Okay, so what we see here, right, is again equanimity, serenity. This is not an upset person who's sorry about what he's done. This is someone who's satisfied with a life well lived, right? And we're still talking about him, so maybe we see something admirable here as well. Okay, so it's been fun actually to talk to you about Socrates. We are finished with the Apology. We're going to move on to talking about the Crito. That's our next dialogue, and then the Euthyphro and etc. after that. If you're aware of what's coming up in terms of the next two readings, that's pretty good. All right. Thanks for watching.